Hi everyone, my name's Otto. I guess everyone can hear me online as well. So this is the current working title for my PhD thesis, and it's Visual Deep Learning meets Primatology, Understanding Great Apes Behaviors Computationally. So the motivation for the project is that many great ape species are either endangered or critically endangered, and that future conservation efforts, amongst many other things, are going to require large-scale and rigorous behavioral analysis. And traditionally, this has always been done by experts such as conservational biologists, ecologists, and primatologists, and they do this manually on a kind of video-by-video basis, which takes lots and lots of time, which, given that great ape species are set to decline another 80% in the next 30 or 40 years, we don't have a lot of. And so AI offers a kind of natural opportunity to automate this process and perform that analysis at scale and at speed. So our project has two main objectives. The first one is to build a classifier for great ape behaviors in video, and we do this using a deep metric learning approach, which I'll talk about in more detail later. And we also prototype a human-in-the-loop system using active learning techniques as a kind of exploration of how we might integrate human knowledge in this area to better optimize model performance. So before I talk about either of those, I'd just like to introduce the data set that we're working with. So we use the Pan-African data set. It comprises about 20,000 videos of great apes. And very fortunately for us, there is a 500 video subset which has fine-grained annotations. And the annotations include the location, the species, and the behavior. And you can see the top two images are where we're displaying the species annotation, and the bottom two images are where we're displaying behaviors. So to make the behaviors more concrete, these are just still images extracted of these behaviors being exhibited, and they're sort of more like actions than detailed behaviors, but it's a starting point for our project. So we have camera interaction, climbing up, climbing down on the top row. In the middle row, we have hanging, running, and sitting. And then on the bottom row, we have sitting on the back, standing, and walking. So onto our first objective. In deep metric learning, we want to train a network to embed inputs onto a metric space. And in this metric space, we want semantically similar representations to be close to one another and dissimilar representations to be distant. So you can kind of see here, in a triplet architecture, we ingest triplets of data, where we have an anchor, which is our reference point. And then we have a positive example, which in this case shares the same class label as our anchor. And then we have a negative example, which has a different class label to our anchor and to our positive. And the kind of learning objective is we want embeddings in this metric space which have the same class label to be very close to one another in terms of distance, and data points with a different class label to be far apart. And so this is enforced by a triplet loss function, which I won't go into too much detail, but it effectively tries to minimize the distance between the anchor and the positive point and ensure that the distance between the anchor and the negative point is greater than the anchor positive pair. So one thing that we have to consider when we're training a triplet architecture is actually how we select our triplets, because naturally the embedding spaces for anchor positive pairs are going to be smaller in distance than anchor negative pairs. And so we might end up choosing lots of triplets that are redundant and we don't really learn much. So two strategies that we experiment with in this project are semi-hard negative mining. So that's where we choose triplets in such a way that the anchor positive pairs are very close to the anchor negative pairs in terms of distance. And that's kind of represented here in this orange space where the anchor and the positive are here. And then the hard negative examples are in kind of an extreme case where the distance between an anchor and the negative is actually less than an anchor and a positive. So this is just a kind of high-level overview. In the previous slide, we just showed a generic model and an overall schematic to sort of illustrate the idea. In this project, this is our actual implementation. Our model on the left is borrowed from the human action recognition domain and later adapted by research at this university for great apes. So the model that we use has two streams. The first one is spatial, and that's represented by 3-channel RGB images, or sequences of RGB images, I should say. And then we have the temporal stream, which is optical flow images, sequence of optical flow images. For those who don't know, optical flow images are kind of a way of tracking the motion of an object across sequences in frames. And so we use the ResNet 18 CNN architecture for feature extraction, and an LSTM, which is a type of recurrent neural network aimed at capturing long-range dependencies between data, is appended to the end of each of those networks. We then push that through two fully connected layers after concatenation and into 128-dimensional embedding space. And it's actually this embedding space which is being optimized during training. And then the architecture on the right is just kind of for completeness, so you know how this fits into a triplet architecture. So once we have a model to produce these embeddings, we actually need to fit a classifier, and deep metric learning gives us an opportunity to use more traditional techniques, such as the k-nearest neighbor, which is used in this project. So how we fit this is where we have our training set, so samples of videos of apes displaying a particular behavior. They are embedded by the model to get our training embeddings, and then we can fit a k-nearest neighbor classifier on those embeddings alongside the training labels. So these are the results that we get. So we trained for 50,000 iterations, and you can sort of read for yourself what the actual model parameters are. And we can see that the hard negative mining doesn't do very well. We get a short increase in performance early on in training, but then slowly tails off. The semi-hard negative mining, again, has a kind of short increase in performance early on, but has a long lag before eventually picking up and is still increasing at the time when training is stopped. But actually just randomly sampling triplets in our case gives us the best performance. There are kind of a number of explanations for this, and we don't really do a rigorous enough analysis of the types of triplets that are being mined. It could well be that there actually just aren't enough examples of hard negative pairs to make this a worthwhile strategy, but this is where we kind of left it because performance wasn't our sort of primary objective here. We just wanted to explore it as a viable approach to this task. But what's really interesting about deep metric learning is that it gives us an opportunity to visualize what's being learned by the network. So on the right, this is each sample in our training set embedded by the model and plotted in 2 dimensions using the TSNE method. And you can immediately kind of start to see that on the left, we have this camera interaction behavior, and it appears to be densely clustered and seems to be distant from the other clusters, which is kind of what you'd expect intuitively. In the bottom center, we see all the behaviors clustered together which are associated with hanging, so climbing up, climbing down, and hanging. And then this kind of turquoise to purple to lighter purple are the sort of 3 sequential behaviors that we see. So sitting into standing into walking. And we see that pattern occur on a number of places on this plot. And it's kind of easy to imagine that they might represent variations of the same sequence of behavior, but that's obviously very optimistic interpretation on my part, but you can kind of see the value in this if you are communicating your results to somebody from the field of ecology or biology. This is a much more pleasing thing to look at and to try and interpret than just traditional performance metrics. So that's kind of where we left this model training and moved on to the human in the loop side of the project. So to prototype a human in the loop system, we use active learning techniques, and active learning techniques are aimed at combining the knowledge of an AI and a human. But the ultimate goal is really to select data points or samples of unlabeled data from a pool of available data, which would provide the most information to the model if we had the annotations. So the idea is that if you have a large pool of data and you only have a specialist available to annotate 10% of that data, how can we choose the most informative samples? So we don't actually use a human in this. We just simulate the role of a human by partitioning the existing training set into an active training set and an active holdout set. And the active holdout set is kind of our pool of unlabeled data where the existing annotations sort of simulate the role of a human. So when we select unlabeled data points, we can add the annotation as if they were being performed by a human. Okay, so the first thing that we do is use prepare a baseline. So the blue line represents the just training on the active training set. So we see that obviously its performance is much less than training on all of the data, as you'd expect. And then we just, as a baseline, randomly sample 10, 20, and 40% of data from our active holdout set, add those back to the training set and train from scratch. And again, as you'd expect, the model with the most additional data performs best, and the model with the least additional data performs worst. So then, how do we actually go about selecting data samples? Well, the first thing that we do is project the active holdout set into the metric space. We then apply two different models to those embeddings. So the first one is a supervised approach, just using our k-nearest neighbor, and the second one is an unsupervised approach, using a Gaussian mixture model. So we apply those models to the embeddings to generate prediction confidences. And then after this, we apply an entropy uncertainty measure so that we can rank our unlabeled data by uncertainty. And the idea here is that the most uncertain data points may provide the most information in terms of model performance, should we provide a label for them. So we tried two different approaches. The first one is uncertainty sampling, where we effectively select a proportion of the most uncertain samples. And so this is a TSNE visualization of our active holdout set, projected in 2 dimensions, and the data points that we're selecting are in gold. So these are the most uncertain data points, and you can see that they're all quite densely clustered in the center of the map. We also try diversity sampling. So this is where, instead of just taking the top proportion of uncertain samples, we sample on a per class basis. And you can kind of see that we get a much more even distribution of selected samples, and there's a tendency for these to occur at cluster boundaries, which is kind of what you'd expect. And then we just compare sampling strategies at different ratios of data. So at 10% additional data, we can see that the uncertainty sampling methods seem to outperform the diversity sampling methods. Interestingly, when we add 20% of data, we can see that the supervised diverse methods of sampling perform best, and our uncertainty sampling methods perform worst. And then at 40% of additional data, we see uncertainty sampling gives us good performance initially, but trails off. And then our kind of unsupervised diversity sampling approaches probably give us the best performance, but at that stage, performance becomes comparable with all the other techniques. So in summary and conclusion, deep metric learning seems to provide a viable approach to behavior recognition. The visualizations are interesting, if not insightful. And in active learning, a small labeling budget is best suited for uncertainty sampling, and larger labeling budgets are best suited for diversity sampling, but there's clearly some instability here, with the key take-home being that all of these streams really need more rigorous work. And one thing that I should mention is, obviously, we only work on the 9 core behaviors, and this is quite a limited set of behaviors, and this will definitely grow and become more fine-tuned and complex, and that will be the kind of future work. So, thank you.
It's interesting to see how you put the human in the loop and then take it out. Questions? Yes.
I noticed you use TSNE as your dimensionality reduction set. Do you reckon this would apply VMAP or something?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, did we consider other dimensionality reduction techniques? Yeah, I mean, it's a big limitation is that we kind of get a nice looking plot there, which is helpful for presentation purposes, but we know that that's not, that interpretation needs to be treated with some caution. So in future, we will definitely look at using different techniques to visualize the space.
Other questions? Yes, yeah.
I think I probably missed something early, but you started with an objective that said you want to use deep metric learning.
Sorry?
You started with an objective that said you want to use deep metric learning.
Yes.
So why deep metric learning? What's the motivation? Like, why not some other technique?
Well, so I suppose that's twofold. One, it's been shown to perform really well on image classification and human action recognition tasks. And then the second criteria to that is this ability to visualize things, is to kind of view the metric space that's being built. And I suppose the sort of long-term goal for the project is to build something that will be useful for the scientific community outside of machine learning and AI, so people in conservational biology. And this provides at least a sort of starting point to be able to present things in an interpretable way. In a more active system, I'm kind of imagining that when we have these maps, you would be able to present them to someone, and then you would perhaps be able to click on data points which are perhaps ambiguous at cluster boundaries, and you'd be able to view the original video sample. And so an expert might look and say, you know, the model is clearly finding this area difficult to classify, you know, what do you think, or something along those lines.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you're planning to incorporate other modalities such as audio.
So we do have audio data. It's not something we've considered yet, but I know that the work that Dan Wheatham and whatnot, they're trying to incorporate audio, because apparently action recognition is classifiable when using only audio data. So it's clearly of some value, but we haven't looked into it yet.